doing right here is getting this paper wet, because of course the flow of the paint will go where the water is, and I have to be a little bit careful about this edge because it's a straight edge at the top of this pillar. So I'm being a little careful how I apply the water so it doesn't bleed into areas that I don't want it to go. And there is some sky blue here, but that might work to my advantage because the blue will help create a shadow effect. I'm using raw umber for my first layer here, and my palette's really dirty with a lot of combinations, but that's fine because the area that I'm going to paint is not a bright, pristine looking piece of concrete. So when you're doing concrete, you're going to have multiple shades of gray, but the underlying reflections and tones come from some of the raw umber, and I'm not putting a lot down. I'll let that bleed down a little bit. And there's also moss growing over the top of this, so to this, for the layer that goes on top of this, I'll be using probably some olive green, some sap green, and hooker's green with a little black. Create that moss. Now I'm also using some cerulean, and that's a good color for creating a shadow effect, and also a little of the, it creates kind of a greenish tinge in combination with the other hues that I've got going, like the umber. And it's kind of speckled and spotted up in here, so I'm going to apply my paint that way. I'm not going to try to put it on evenly. Just kind of dot it, jab it, touch it on. There's a lot of moss right here. And I'm just going to let that work around. I don't want to brush it. If I start brushing it, it'll smooth out, and I like the texture. I want to retain that. So here's a little bit of the green I'm just touching on here. I put a little yellow in it. Not much. And some black. And you can get a nice green with a combination of cad yellow and black. And this stuff is growing on top of this pillar, and it is kind of creeping over the edge. And this is going to ultimately be pretty dark here. My gray, one good combination for a good gray is alizarin crimson with black and some blue, and I need to test this. So I better grab a piece of scrap paper. This should do the job. See what I'm getting, and I think that's going to work. And I want this predominantly gray, because it is concrete. There is a lot of other color in it. And most of the brush strokes I'm pulling down, because that's what I would assume that moss is going to do. It may defy gravity to an extent. I'll let that touch that color on and let it creep around. Now this upper edge to the concrete is a little too brown. I'm going to put some water here. And let it sit on the edge. And then I'm going to lift it with a paper towel, because I don't want that much of a brown color there. So this should remove quite a bit of that. And now it's much more pale, and I'm going to use my gray. And I did end up eliminating some of that gray and darker values that I'd put down, but that's okay, because this is essentially an underlayer, and I'm a little happier with this value here. And I could touch back in here with some of this dark. It's just a darker value of gray. But I'm going to want green. So I'm going back into the olive green, black, it'll combine with that gray. Now some of this goes right down to the edge. Kind of curls under and drops down. So it still needs to be a little darker. And I'm going to pull in a little shadow. Let that work its way down. There's times when you have to take a minute. Your paper can get too dry, and I don't want to spray the paper, so I'm just going to have a little bit of patience here. You dry out your brush and pull through some of that color, and it will soften it just using a dry brush. I want to leave a little bit of the light coming through in the concrete in areas here. Got some more olive. There's parts of this that are quite dark. We'll let that work its way down. Now this whole underlip of this concrete structure here, it's all in shadow, so I'm going back and working, I'm just pushing my brush and I'm working up and creating a darker tone. It's a little too much, too dark. So I'll lift that, I'll just clean my brush, squeeze it out, get some water on that spot, just work the water. I'm going to create a little bit of a shadow here. And back to the olive and black. Just a few touches to indicate the moss there. Now, if you're doing something you're not thrilled about, it's hard to know when to stop sometimes. In my case, usually results in a mistake or something I want to alter. And that means picking it up and going back. The next layer. Paper's still a little bit wet. Probably a little too wet. So I'm going to have to take a second and go on to something else here for a minute. I'm throwing in a little white occasionally while the paper's wet. The white has a property of reducing the intensity. This white is Chinese white, which is pretty much transparent. It doesn't have an opaque quality. It doesn't drastically alter your colors, but it will subdue them. I use white very sparingly, generally just to create a mix that that it does not have a lot of intensity. It doesn't have much chroma. It's just sort of a, well, something like concrete, for example. I'm going to work on another section here. I got to get the paper wet again. And I'll do this area. Now the water's got color to it, which is fine because this is all pretty dark in through here. I've got a shadow to do. And this is all leading down to the brick. So this is a piece of molding. It's concrete though. I mean, it's shaped like molding. And this portion of it is going to be quite dark. This is the underside of the big concrete ledge. So I'll be careful with my water. I don't want a lot of water on this. I don't want it flowing all over the place. In fact, I'm going to work the area beneath it. Now this portion's got a little more color in it. I've got a little bit of cad orange mixed with some raw umber and a little burnt sienna, which is a reddish brown. And I'm just going to drag a little of that. And I want a little more. Now this will diffuse a lot, so it's mostly gray. And my gray's coming from, again, alizarin crimson, and I'm using cerulean blue and a little bit of black. Makes a pretty good gray. I'm going to go back up now for a few touches up above. And that's dried quite a bit, so I've got to be careful. Now I can do this dark. The dark I'm going to use alizarin, make kind of a purplish color. I'm going to use alizarin and blue. In this case, you can use any blue you want. I've got a little Payne's gray and a little cerulean. Makes a nice purple, lavender. I want it darker. I'll probably add a little black to it, tone it down. There we go. Where the paper's still very wet, I gotta wait a minute. But right here, I'm okay. I'm gonna bring that over here because it's also really dark right in through here. Just work that all the way over to these bricks. Well, that isn't dark enough and there's too much color to it, so I'm going to have to use some black and some sepia, very deep dark brown. That's really bleeding into the area below it. So, probably going to lift a little of that. Just using a paper towel and folding it, giving it kind of a straight edge. Put it in place where I want to pick up. Just run my finger over it once. Picks up a whole lot of it. And still not dark enough. Back to the drawing board. A little deeper mixture this time. I have to wait on it for a minute. So by doing a lift, you can really soften an edge if you need it. In my case, I didn't like any of what was going on there. It was just bleeding too much. Okay, I can handle that color a little more. I'm going to add a little bit of sepia. And olive, and get some better darks in this moss. And I'll just touch them in. It's going to really look like I'm drawing lines, but this is going to bleed and become part of the moss. So I'm going to let that sit for a minute, and then I'll go back over it with some water, and that should diffuse it. Still getting too much of a bleed right here. Pick that up. Yeah, I like that color a lot better. Got a little area to touch up in the green. That's behind this. So it's foliage and greenery behind the wrought iron in the background, so I don't want white edges, so I'm hitting those. And to push it all back into the distance, keep the colors subdued. Don't make them too bright or they draw the eye. So by keeping them faint, they won't draw too much attention. So here's the other part of this that I should continue across with. Get it wet. This is concrete though, so I don't want a bunch of yellow. However, it's super dark, and for that I'm going to be using, first layer will be kind of a blue-gray, lavender gray. This part's going to be very dark. It's really great to be using this paper. It's really tough stuff. It's very heavy, and I notice I've got a few scratches, in the paper. Well, a lot of times those create a nice effect because when you scratch the paper, the pigment settles in and makes it a little bit darker, which is just fine in this case. Got a little bit of everything going here. Raw umber, sepia, a little bit of alizarin. I'm going to keep it on the brownish, and I'm actually going to put some green with it. And where things start to kind of bleed out and they look like little tributaries on a river, I often leave those alone. I like that effect, and they actually come through underneath your other colors. You'll see them. You'll see that layer, like over here where I used some cerulean blue and some lavender color and the raw umber. It's coming through, even though the predominant color there is that kind of mossy green. You need those colors to come through a little bit so that you have the appearance of concrete. Without it, it's just going to look like a piece of wood. I'm going to hit this just a little touch of white in with my gray. And I don't need very much. There's a bunch of moss and stuff growing on the top of this pillar beneath the rim of this support for the big ball up there. Now I have to do that too. I haven't got the little support ring. It looks like somebody threw it on a potter's wheel, like a big dish. And for that, I'm going to stay in the blue-gray spectrum. I'm loading a very small brush for my first line that I want here. And it's going to go about like so. There's a secondary one. And that goes like that. It makes a really good guideline for me, for my shading on that. Almost looks like a pencil line. It's really small. And for the shadow on that, I'm going to use some umber and gray. And it's kind of like any other 3D form. You want it to get darker on the far side of the light, which would be over on this side here. And I can just pull that over. That's not something I really want much color in because I don't want to highlight it. It's not an area that I really want to draw a lot of attention to. So I stay away from any really strong accents. Because if you do put a bright white or a really dark accent on there, it'll draw the eye. For the moss growing on top here, I'm going to go with more of the olive. I'm just going to touch this on here. And I want some irregular brush strokes. There's actually a little highlight of kind of a reddish brown, some sort of growth on top of this thing. So I'm just going to touch in very little bit of well, it's a mix of some burnt sienna, raw umber, a little bit of orange, don't want to overdo it, just a touch. Okay, well, this area is going to be dark, so drag some color across it. And it's got to go quite a bit darker yet. Well, this ought to do it. I'm using the side of my brush and I'm just kind of tapping it down and giving it a little pull. Putting a little bit of red back in, the shadow back in here. Now, you know, red's a warm color, but it works well in shadows. If you don't use a bright red. This seems painstakingly slow, but that's my method, I'm afraid. It's getting very dark. I need this shadow here to be equally dark. That one I'm going to let bleed down into the next section. So I'm going to just put some water beneath that paint that I just put on, and doing that, it'll bring it down. Into here. So this section here, super dark again. We'll just keep building it up. I don't want this hard edged line here, which I will eliminate momentarily. Still has to go darker. I'm going to put some green in with this. let that come down. This too has to be darker. And the next little ledge or lip that I have to deal with is right here. Go a little bit wider. Now that what I just painted, that's too distinct, but that's going to be alright. As soon as I start working on the part above, the color is going to bleed out of it and move up. It's kind of an indentation. That I want to get in this. And through here. Put a touch of this is sienna. And that was a little bit of Chinese white. It just blends the edge out. There's a little spot I don't like over here. Painstakingly slow, I understand. I can't help it. I don't know when I started working like this. I think I was just painting some really small object. And I thought, that's kind of fun. I don't know if it's, you know, it can be tedious, but it's also really, the results can be pretty dramatic. Now there isn't this much detail. I mean, there's a lot of detail in this painting, clearly. But I choose where to put the detail. I don't just detail every single thing. It's where I want to draw the eye is primarily where I'm putting most attention. So it may look like, you know, I painted every individual leaf. No. A lot of it I allowed to happen. Just trying to control the paint with the water. And the gate obviously has a lot of detail work. But then if you look in the section here behind the wall, the section behind the gate, actually a lot of this hedge, you'll see, well, I don't know that you can see the hedge, but there's a lot of freer style of painting that went into it. And even in an area like this, the shadows, I just kind of let the paint go. And these kinds of things sort of develop organically. I start to see leaves as I'm working through the layers, and I start to accentuate it, but this was all fairly wet, and I let the paint flow, and I wasn't trying to paint individual leaves. In fact, the only ones that I did were up here in the foreground, and as you move back, you can see it's just gestures, the paintbrush just the stroke of the brush, the direction of the brush, the darks in between the lights, and you get the appearance of that foliage. It feels organic. It looks like, plants. And that's how I like to paint it. The same thing are true with these trees, some of the trees in the background. Really not as much control as what I'm doing right with the top of that pillar.